Good evening and welcome. My name is Molly Anderson, and as Executive Director of the Athenaeum, and on behalf of the Board of the Athenaeum and the Hayes and Laibe families, I wish to welcome you to the 8th Annual Constance Laibe Hayes Memorial Lecture. First, please turn off those pesky cell phones if you have them. And that would be mostly everybody in this room, I'm sure. Secondly, I just wanted to say that Ms. Scott's book, A Singular Woman, will be available for sale and signing in the lobby down that first flight of stairs immediately following her remarks today. Libraries, particularly public libraries, can make a real difference in the lives of people, no matter what their age. And Connie certainly acknowledged how important the Athenaeum was in her life. And the Athenaeum is delighted to host each year this memorial lecture, which reminds us of the importance of reading and writing and libraries in general in all of our lives. Please join me in welcoming Constance and John's daughter, Sophie, who will be introducing our speaker today.
Hi, thank you guys so much for coming tonight. Well, on the subject of this evening's lecture and Janny's book, motherhood is certainly something that I don't know anything about. Unlike Stanley Ann Dunham, I was not a mother at 17, and I don't plan on becoming one anytime soon. But not unlike Stanley Ann Dunham, I have learned that life can be unconventional, and but that doesn't mean that it still can't be singular. But I really couldn't think of a better speaker for this year's Constance Laibe Hayes Memorial Lecture, which is a series my family began to bring exceptional writers to the island that we may or may not know. But fortunately, fortunately, this year we do know Janny, and I've always known Janny as my mother's good friend from the Times, where Janny worked until 2008, when she left to begin writing this book. And I know Janny from growing up on Nantucket with Mia and Owen, her kids too. And all these women in my life and everyone else's life have proved that there are many singular women in our lives. So without further ado, Janny Scott.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you to the Laibe and Hayes families for asking me to come here today. I'm honored to be here, and thank you for all of you for coming. And also I want to thank Amy Janess from the Athenaeum for moving heaven and earth to get me the visuals that will go with my talk, which I thought would make it more interesting. I met Connie, I think the first day I went to work at the Times, and she became one of my closest friends there. One of the qualities that I loved about her most was her humor. She had a wry, understated, gently subversive sensibility that deftly upended whatever assumptions you might have made about her or her approach to the world. And that quality was always a useful reminder to the rest of us that we would be wise never to take ourselves too seriously. So if I make a pompous fool of myself up here today, I'll at least have the consolation of knowing that Connie's having a good laugh. So I'm going to talk about the book that I wrote and another that I'm just starting to write. When I started on the second one, I wondered why I had chosen something so unlike anything I'd ever done. I'm still not entirely sure, but I do find that what they do have in common is one way or another, both of them are about family. So the idea for A Singular Woman began with this photograph that's before you. I was during the campaign of 2007, 2008, I was working for the Times, and I was assigned to do a series of biographical pieces about Barack Obama, then Senator Barack Obama. And during the course of this, I interviewed someone who sent me this photograph afterward, and I it's a fascinating picture to me in that it shows a group of people, including Barack Obama in his 20s and his mother in her 40s, on the roof of a building on Riverside Drive in Manhattan. When I saw that picture, I had never seen a picture of Ann Dunham, his mother, and I'd never seen the two of them together. I really hadn't thought much about her, and there was something about the juxtaposition of these two people, the seeming similarities and differences between them that just captivated me. And I began collecting string, wrote a piece about her that ran on the front page of the Times in March of 2008, and the reaction to that piece was greater than the response to almost any other piece I wrote about him, out of which came a book offer. So as Sophie said, I left the Times to do the book. In the public imagination, the president's mother had been, and perhaps still is, a sort of series of useful oversimplifications. In the mind of the media at the time, she was the white woman from Kansas, always coupled alliteratively with the black father from Kenya. She was, in the voice of the campaign, she was the single mother on food stamps, or the cancer victim who died young fighting her insurance company. And in the president's memoir, she was always the innocent abroad, as he described her, a lonely witness for secular humanism, a soldier for New Deal, Peace Corps, position paper liberalism. And on the internet, she was and still is the atheist, the Marxist, the hippie, the flower child, the woman who at 18 was clever enough to fool the Hawaii State Health Department into giving her a birth certificate for her Kenyan-born son. So there's a little truth in some of those characters, though not the last one, but they obscure, it seems to me, a far more complex and interesting story that challenges our assumptions about what it means to be a mother, what it means to be a good mother, and also a story that sheds light on the president himself. For those of you who, to whom this subject is new, I'll just run very quickly through some basic facts about her life. She was born Stanley Ann Dunham in Kansas in 1942. She grew up moving across the country with her peripatetic parents, went to high school in Mercer Island, Washington, was transplanted again at the age of 17 by her father to Hawaii, where she enrolled in the University of Hawaii in the fall of 1960, and within weeks was pregnant with the child of one of the first African students at the University of Hawaii, Barack Obama Sr. She dropped out of school, married him. The relationship was over by the time the child was born, the young Barack Obama, in August of 1961. She then, several years later, married an Indonesian student at the University of Hawaii, and in '67 moved to Indonesia with her son to join her husband, lived there until 1971, came back to Hawaii, became a graduate student in anthropology, returned to Indonesia in the mid-'70s to do her field work in small villages in Java, worked her way from there into consulting jobs in international development while working on her dissertation, ended up at the Ford Foundation as a program officer in Jakarta in the early '80s, later worked in Pakistan as again a development consultant, and then in microfinance in Indonesia, where she was in the late '80s and early '90s working on what at the time was the largest commercial microfinance program in the world. As I write in the book, to describe Ann Dunham as a white woman from Kansas is about as illuminating as describing her son as a politician who likes golf. Intentionally or not, the label obscures an extraordinary story. A story of, sorry, I'm not completely have total mastery over this thing, of a girl with a boy's name who grew up in the years before the women's movement, the Vietnam War, and the pill, who married an African at a time when nearly 24 states had laws against interracial marriage, who at 24 moved to Jakarta with her 6-year-old son in the waning days of an anti-communist bloodbath in which hundreds of thousands of Indonesians were slaughtered, who sent him back alone at age 10 for a better education, who lived more than half of her life in a country barely known to many Americans, the country with the largest Muslim population in the world, spent her many years working in villages where an unaccompanied Western woman was a rarity, studied a sacred craft, blacksmithing or ironworking, long practiced exclusively by men, who, as a working and mostly single mother, brought up 2 biracial children, believed her son in particular had the potential to be great, who raised him to be, as he has put it, a combination between Albert Einstein, Mahatma Gandhi, and Harry Belafonte, and who died at 52 in November 1995, shortly after he had launched his first campaign for political office, without ever knowing who or what he would become. Had she lived, Ann Dunham would have been 66 years old when Barack Obama was sworn in as the 44th president of the United States. So I approached this book as a journalist. I'm not a psychologist or a person with any particular knowledge of mother-son relations. I'm not a historian. I had a relatively tight 2-year book contract, and so I went to the places that she had lived and worked, and I interviewed as many people as I could who had known her and worked with her. I interviewed close to 200 people, including both of her children and most of her living relatives, obviously not the dead ones. And I went through a lot of archives, her field notes, which are kind of personal, professional diaries that gave me a real sense of her voice and her eye and her sense of humor. Many things surprised me about Ann Dunham and her story, not least of which was her family. And one thing in particular, the place that education had in her family's history. Going back to the Oklahoma Territory, in one branch of the family, all the sons were being sent to college. Her aunts and uncles, 3 of the 4 of them went to graduate school, 2 of them have PhDs, and on both sides of the family, many of her forebears were teachers. Her parents, Stanley and Madeleine Dunham, were far less conventional than the stereotype would suggest. Madeleine Dunham, not unlike her daughter, had rebelled early, or if that's what she was doing, made her unconventionality more apparent early on. She had married in secret while still in high school a man that her parents couldn't stand. And then when she got out of high school, immediately left for California with him. She ended up, unfortunately for her, supporting him for most of his life. She worked her way up without a college education to being a bank vice president. But her sister told me that she bitterly regretted not having pursued her education. And it was that feeling of loss about her own life that led her to support her daughter in the way that she did when she became pregnant and dropped out of college in her freshman year there. Madeleine Dunham offered not only physical, moral, but also financial support to her daughter really for the rest of her life as she went through her undergraduate degree and her interminable pursuit of her PhD, which she finally got shortly before she died. I've never been entirely comfortable, I'm sorry, I missed a few pictures here. These are family pictures. I've never been entirely comfortable trying to state definitively how Ann Dunham shaped her son, defining her impact on his character. The job it seemed that I could credibly do was to report the previously undiscovered facts of her life, enabling other people to reflect on those questions themselves. That said, it is possible to suggest where some clues probably lie. First, this is Lolo Soetoro, her Indonesian husband. First, in her decision to take the young Barack Obama to Indonesia in a critical period of his childhood. Javanese society is intensely color conscious, and he stood out there in a very obvious way. Many Indonesians told me that they see qualities that they consider Javanese in the president, a kind of restraint and what they described as courtesy and a sort of refinement. They pointed out to me that in Indonesian schools, which he had attended, there is a sort of, and with children in general in Java, there is a culture of teasing to inculcate self-restraint, through which people are to learn that when confronted with hostility or difficulty, they are not to sort of rise to the bait, but just move on. Another area in her life that I think is revealing in terms of his life is her work. In 1979, sorry, this is, again, I'm falling behind on the pictures. This is her Indonesian husband's job mapping the border with Papua New Guinea when he first returned to Indonesia in the 60s before she came, and that's Anne with the two grandmothers of her second child, Maya Satoro, Lolo's daughter. And there is Lolo with their daughter. I wanted to talk a bit about Ann Dunham's work and my thoughts about how it perhaps, the effect that it had on her son. In 1979, she took a job in Semarang in the north coast of Java, developing kind of rural credit programs on a large U.S.-sponsored development program. Her boss at the time described that job to me as community organizing in Java. This was 5 years before Barack Obama became a community organizer. Several years later, when she was at the Ford Foundation, she worked with a man named Adi Sasono, who was a very interesting son of Muslim social activists who went on to become a government minister in Indonesia. And he, at the time, was exploring alternative routes to development. A British development person compared him to, said he's basically the Indonesian Saul Alinsky, who's the father of the American community organizing movement. When I interviewed the president, he credited his mother with his decision to go into public service. He said that had grown out of values that she had instilled, particularly an interest in poverty and a sense that creating opportunities for people who don't have them is probably the most worthwhile thing one can do with one's life. On the other hand, he said his decision to settle in Chicago, to marry a woman deeply rooted in Chicago, and to establish a kind of stability for his children that he didn't have was a reaction against what he called the constant motion that was my childhood. As for the relationship between the two of them, she adored him, clearly, and believed that he had the capacity to do great things. People remembered her from when he was a small child, her saying that he could do anything, including being the first black president. An Indonesian friend of hers told me that when Barack Obama was graduating from Harvard Law School, Anne told him that, and he said, this man imagined himself to be very knowledgeable about the secrets of American society. He said, so he's going to be a billionaire. And Anne apparently corrected him and said, no, he wants to return to Chicago and do pro bono work. And so this man, Madai Swarjana, said, so he wants to be president. And according to him, Anne wept when he said that, began to weep, and it was the only time he'd ever seen her cry. And she said, no, not this time, he's going to be a senator first. So she does also seem, however, to have wondered about her place in his life. She was in the United States when he was elected the first black president of the Harvard Law Review, and a lot of articles, newspaper profiles were written about him at that time where it's fascinating to go back and look at them. You see the way he's beginning to tell the story that became his memoir, a story heavily centered on his father. She returned to Indonesia at that time and said to a friend of hers, I was reduced to one line, his mother is an anthropologist. Another close colleague of hers said that when he moved to Chicago and began to sort of lay the groundwork for his future political career there, she felt, as this friend put it, a bit wistful and sad that he had chosen to take on a really strongly identified black identity. She felt that he was making what he called a professional choice. When I interviewed the president, he described his mother as a strong person, quote, in her own way, resilient, persistent. She completed her dissertation and got her PhD after something like 20 years, but disorganized in ways that had spilled over into his life. And I said, well, disorganization, that could mean anything from a messy room to a messy life. And he said, all of the above. He said he didn't hold her choices against her, however, that she'd given him the single most important thing a parent could give a child, a sense of unconditional love. I asked him about this sense of her as a sort of naive idealist, which didn't seem to be borne out by much that I'd heard from people who'd known her well, but seemed to emanate from his characterization of her in his book. And he said he did think of her that way, but not as a pejorative. I asked him if there was a moment in the campaign, this is the 2008 campaign, where he'd thought about her or had any kind of epiphany about her, and he said, well, actually, the night of the Iowa caucuses in January 2008, he said, several weeks before, it hadn't been at all clear that a black candidate could could kind of anywhere near winning in Iowa, in a white state like Iowa. And yet that night, he was at this caucus site in Des Moines, and it was a very diverse crowd, even for Iowa, you know, black, Hispanic. He said there were a lot of eccentric-looking people there, including a man who looked like Gandalf with a long white beard and a crook, which he had somehow rigged a television monitor onto the top of the crook that was looping an Obama campaign commercial. And he said, I thought that night, as we were leaving, I kind of teared up, and I thought, not wouldn't my mother be proud of me, but wouldn't she have loved to be at that caucus? Because you know, she would have felt right at home, because it was sort of imbued with her spirit and captured something that she had given him and vindicated what she believed in. And I said, well, what was that exactly? And he said, a sense that beneath our surface differences, we're more the same than different, and that there's more good than bad in each of us, and that we can reach across the void and work together. And then he said, that's precisely the naivete and idealism that was part of her, and that's, I suppose, the naive idealism in me. Now, lurching to the second part of my talk, after that book came out, I had some free time. And I had been told that there was a kind of family archive of sorts in a room in a house on a farm in Pennsylvania where my father, 4 generations of my father's family had lived, and I had grown up there. And I just thought I had a little bit of time then, why not take a look? I had spent the first 14 years of my life in this rather unusual place, a 650-acre kind of family compound, functioning dairy farm in the middle of some of the richest suburbs in the United States. It was a place that occasionally attracted some attention from time to time because the land was extraordinarily beautiful. The place was something of an anachronism, and there had always been several generations of not uninteresting characters inhabiting it. But as a child, I had always seen it as a child sees things, you know, somewhat sort of at ground level. Even as an adult, I'd understood very little about how the place had come about and really who these people were, what their lives were beyond what I'd seen. And then I had left at 14 and never really moved back. And it never occurred to me until I started looking in this archive how understanding what was there might shed light on a number of things, not least of which was the puzzling figure to me of my father and his, at that time, recent and, as I saw it, stubbornly self-destructive death. The papers, of course, turned out to be a sort of random assortment of things, haphazardly heaped into dozens of file boxes. But there were some interesting things. Records of the invention of this place in the first decades of the 20th century, through which I saw really for the first time how much it was a projection of the ego and imagination of my great-grandfather. Land that had been reshaped, trees moved, tenant houses copied from books, cows flown in, or not flown in, shipped in from Scotland. There was also correspondence from my grandparents' remarkable 70-year marriage, and records of my father's rather extravagant effort to, as he was dying, to restore the seemingly doomed 50-room house in the center of this place that had been built before World War I to its original grandiose splendor. In other words, good material. So I had, you know, a setting and a cast of characters that had made its way into popular culture. I had intersections here with interesting episodes in American political and economic and social history, themes of aspiration, ambition, self-invention, and self-destruction, and, you know, like any story, mysteries and buried secrets. So the threads of that have led me further afield to Paris in the 1880s when Americans of a certain ilk flocked there, Bar Harbor, Maine when it was the Nantucket of its day, the volunteer ambulance corps in France during World War I, a South Carolina plantation during the Depression, Washington during the Teapot Dome scandal, the Glass-Steagall Act hearings, the Philippines under Japanese occupation. So now, of course, I have to figure out what to do with all that. What I wanted to say, tying these two disparate themes together, is that each type of family story has its own challenges. Poking around in the life of the mother of the president posed peculiar problems. So there were people who would try to calculate whether talking to me would help or hurt his chances of election or re-election. There were some people who claimed greater intimacy with his mother than I eventually could see that they had, including one high school classmate of hers who developed a late-in-life career filling the notebooks of journalists like me with stories, some of them other people's stories into which she had inserted herself. Writing about your own family, however, I suspect is even tougher. Ultimately, you have to judge the circumstances in which you were raised in a manner that you never thought to. You have to see yourself as in some ways a product of that world. You have to find a voice and a tone and a relationship to the material that feels true. And you have to concern yourself with the feelings that you might step on and relinquish once and for all the pose of objective observer. So I've wondered what perverse impulse is luring me deeper and deeper into an undertaking so unlike anything I've ever done, and so far outside my zone of competence. But I remembered recently being invited to lunch some years ago in New York by a well-known book agent in a midtown Manhattan hotel. It was apparent when I got there that she ate the same tiny piece of lunch every day at the same table for two, well-positioned, day in and day out, and I was just one of many. I guess we talked about books, but what I really remember is that she told me with absolute certainty, one day you will write about your family. And she was like a doctor looking at a lab report or some kind of DNA analysis and saying, you will develop migraine or psoriasis or pancreatic cancer. When I was working on A Singular Woman, I was occasionally conscious of how unnerving it must be to have someone digging around in your family's story, and how little we actually know about the members of our own. A few months before the book came out, when it was too late to make any changes, I sent copies to the president and to his sister, Maya Soetoro Eng, who I had gotten to know quite well, her, not him, during the course of this. And I FedExed it to her in Hawaii. And the next morning, after she had received it, I received a voicemail that had been left at 2 a.m. Hawaii time. She had stayed up reading the book, and as I recall that message, the best part of it was this sentence: there were a lot of surprises, but none of it sounded untrue. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer them, attempt to answer them. Yes?
In your search of your family archives, have you found things that would be embarrassing to your family as a whole, or how are you, when you unearth things, how are you going to deal with some of those issues that may be relevant to living?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And, absolutely, of course you encounter things that could be embarrassing. And I'm not in this to write a tell-all about my family. I'm trying to capture a place and a world and perhaps a chain of influence that on those who came after or will come after. So I can't answer that question because I haven't written it yet, but my answer would be very carefully. I'm not, that's an interesting problem. As a journalist, when you find difficult material, you're not as concerned about the feelings of the person, the feelings that could be affected by the use of that material. I'm not saying you're never concerned, because of course you are. There's all sorts of decisions about taste and those sorts of things that go into journalistic writing. But it's a matter of getting at a certain kind of truth. And I would like to say I would not pull my punch if I felt it was important. But I also know there are a lot of things that are, they say in the law, there's probably lawyers in here, about the prejudicial value outweighing the probative value, that there's some things that are such blockbuster scandal stuff, and not that I found that they would eclipse everything else. So I think I'm conscious of the risks in using that material and the desire not to have it become what I'm writing about, because that's not the center of my story. But yes, I have encountered material that in the wrong hands or mishandled could be embarrassing. Yes?
You have an indication what the president thought of the book? Has he read it?
I was told the president had read it, and I was told that he liked it, but I couldn't tell whether the person telling me this was just trying to give me an answer. You know, I don't really think he probably read it. He might have skimmed it, and I know that Maya briefed him fully after her reading of it. And I would love to know what he thought if he even looked at it, but I can't say for sure.
My guess is he read it. That's my guess.
Someone told, possibly, although he has pretty high-level reading habits. Somebody told me that sometime after the book came out, they heard him speak about his mother in a way that they'd never heard him talk before, with a level of detail that he had never used. So I don't make any great claims to that. The fact is, most of us don't understand our parents' work very well and don't have the time to go back and find out about it. So I'm sure there were things in there that were new. Yes? I didn't hear. I'm sure she would want to read it, yes. I didn't hear that, but a friend of mine sat next to her at a lunch and said to her, asked her a question about the book. I can't remember what. And she said at that time, which was right after it had come out, she said, well, I saw the magazine piece, which I thought was excerpted in the Times Magazine, which I thought was well written. But she said, but it wasn't an authorized biography, which I, of course, think that's a compliment, but I don't think she intended that way. You had a question?
Yes. My understanding is that Barack Obama's mother died of ovarian cancer. Is that correct?
Well, it's sort of unclear. Ovarian and uterine. It was misdiagnosed, multiply misdiagnosed, first as appendicitis, then, although maybe she'd had appendicitis at that point, but then she didn't recover from that, and she went back, this is in Indonesia, she went back to Hawaii. She was diagnosed, I think, with ovarian, and then they concluded that actually the dominant cancer had been uterine and it had spread. So it's ambiguous which it was, but one of those.
I always felt that the president going after health care was related to his mother's problems with insurance.
Well, that's what he said, but what I actually found was that his mother had insurance. The one thing she didn't have was disability insurance that would cover lost wages. So he was involved in the struggle to get her, because I've seen the correspondence on this, to get her covered for lost wages. But there was a pre-existing condition clause to the disability insurance, but not to her health insurance. So she had health insurance. Yes?
What were the signs of rapists that she saw in her son at an early age? And did she see them in her daughter? What's the dynamic behind that?
That's a good question. I think she found him very, bright and sharp and somewhat precocious in a way that that's not the way she described her daughter. A good friend actually commented upon that to me, that that there really was a disparity in the way she seemed to talk about her two children. However, her daughter lived with her entire childhood. She was homeschooled through the age of 12, whereas her son lived with her for the first 10 years, then lived with his grandparents, and she was there for a bit, and then she was gone again for all of high school. So she actually had a much closer relationship with Maya, and I don't think Maya feels that she was badly parented. And perhaps Ann Dunham saw something. They're both remarkable people, but perhaps Ann Dunham saw something that I don't know exactly what it was. Yes, Nancy.
Do you in the end feel that this is a non-journalistic cut? Do you feel like you like her after all?
A lot of people ask me that, and I always would sort of huffily say, well, I don't think about it that way. She's just really interesting. I do quite like her, actually. I think she'd probably be difficult and prickly. And I once had a dream where she appeared, only once. I was like, I met her, this is the person who's writing that book about you. And she was perfectly fine there. No, my feeling is, I quite admire her. I think she made a lot of mistakes, a certain number of mistakes, as we all do. I think she corrected for them in a very impressive way under very difficult circumstances. I think she was intellectually fascinating. She was really, in some ways, out of her time, from a really, how she came together is an interesting story. So, yeah, I do like her, but I don't, I guess it's the problem with the term like. What is meant by like? Is like a person that you'd like to, hang out with for the next 6 months, or is it a person who interests you? So I think I'm more on the interest end, but I found her really interesting. Yes.
Indonesia is a very complicated religious place. It's not just Islam. There's animistic religions and mysticism.
Yeah.
A central Java, probably most of all. Do you find that affected her at all, or either of them, their outlook?
I'm not sure I can fully answer this just on the basis of how much time I spent, but my sense is that her husband came from a relatively secular family in a relatively secular time, that Indonesia has become more religious, or that Indonesian brand of Islam has become somewhat more conservative recently. They were urban Muslims who celebrated Muslim holidays, but I don't think there was a lot of religious experience in that family. Then, for herself, she approached religion as an anthropologist. She was very interested in religion as culture. And so wherever she traveled, she would, light candles and participate in those various rites of different religions out of respect and also out of sort of anthropologist curiosity. So I don't think she was particularly, there are interesting dimensions of Islam that make their way into some of what she taught her children, but those are also in Christianity. So I don't feel like it was a powerful influence that I'm aware of. Yes?
In your presentation, you did not mention Obama's grandmother.
Well, I did, Madeleine, I was talking about. Anne and Madeleine? That's a good question. I didn't get into that. They were very, very different people. Madeleine Dunham, in fact, Maya described it to me once in this way. She said, Madeleine, if it was a matter of getting from A to B, she would look straight ahead and go directly to that place, whereas Anne would veer off onto the path and examine this and pull up a rock and look underneath the rock and wander back, and it was very circuitous and kind of whimsical. And in fact, it was also pointed out to me that her mother, Anne's mother, Madeleine, was rather like Michelle. So I think they were very different, and I think Madeleine was, and yet Madeleine had an unconventional quality to her, as I did allude to, that I think enabled her to some extent, tolerate and be patient with her daughter, whose decisions she differed with. So I think it was a trying, somewhat tested relationship that lasted over time, in that they never had a complete falling out, but that required a lot of sort of mutual respect. I think it was not an easy parent-child relationship.
Actually, I met the other grandmother who became great about politically.
No, that's the one I mean, Madeleine. Yeah, I'm speaking about her when she's younger. The one who died the day before he was elected.
That's right. And in the politics, we used to hear about her, and her effect upon us specifically in Chicago.
Her effect? Are you talking about, really, Madeleine Dunham's effect on Barack Obama's politics?
Yes.
I don't know much about that. I mean, they did, as you know, he lived with them. They were Democrats, but that's about, and they had been Unitarians, so that tells you something. But I never heard that she was particularly influential in shaping his politics, but I may be wrong. I think. Yes, Glenn.
If she lived, she'd only be 70 now. Have you ever thought about how she might evaluate your son's president?
I've thought about it because journalists ask me that question. That's interesting. I think, I'm not sure I can answer that because it's just too speculative, but I think she would not be a very visible, president's mother. I think she would be possibly in another country a lot of the time. She would not be hanging around in Washington. She would probably have strong opinions that she perhaps expressed to him, but we wouldn't hear about them. As for how she would evaluate, I just don't know. I mean, I think, I was thinking when I went over what I was going to say, I was thinking about how differently some of this stuff may sound now to the way it sounded when my book came out just 2 years ago. When we are, mired in the mire that Washington has become, and we've heard endlessly about how he has failed to accomplish what he hoped to accomplish and how he wasn't able to bring people together, well, is that a failure of what she represented? This notion, this rather romantic notion that he articulated about in that story about the Iowa caucuses, this notion that there's more similarity than difference between us and more good than bad, and we can reach across the void. Well, does the last couple of years tell you that's true? So I don't know how she would think about that, but I also think that's part of his romantic view of her, when in fact she was a pretty hard-headed kid herself. Hard-headed in her work, didn't take a lot of guff from underlings, so would she tell him to get tougher? I just don't know. Yes? The subject was village industries in Java, particularly the use of cottage industries and their role as a survival strategy for people who had been, many of them, forced off the land through the Green Revolution, through the efficiencies of the Green Revolution. So, and she's particularly focused, as I mentioned, on blacksmithing, ironworking, which is a very elevated craft in Java. It has spiritual connotations, and the people who practice it are revered. But she also looked at basket making and ceramics and all this stuff, and it's very interesting. Almost 1,000 pages. So why did it take so long? Well, I think a lot of dissertations, as I understand it, take a long time. Partly because people can't. They get enamored of their field work, or they can't support themselves while they're trying to write their dissertation, so they have to go off and do jobs, which is what happened to her. But I also think she was just endlessly curious, and she kept expanding her research. It was originally something like 12 industries, and her thesis advisor said to me, I finally said to her, cut it down, you've got to pick 4. So I think it was a combination of personality and also just economics. She had to keep going off and doing these various jobs. She would do the jobs and support her family for a while, but at the same time she developed new areas of curiosity. Yes? I was absolutely amazed when I finally heard her voice on a tape. It was an audio tape that someone gave me in Indonesia of a talk that she had given about textile making. And I remember distinctly where I was when I heard it, because I couldn't play it there, and I took it back. I took it to the United States, and I was driving somewhere, and I put it in, and it was a very high voice like this, not at all what I expected. This really quite powerful person, but she had a kind of light, girlish voice, but she had a big, horsey laugh that many people tried to imitate, very earthy laugh. But I was shocked by her voice. I almost don't believe it. I almost think she had laryngitis that night or something. Yes?
Did she push for her son to go to Unahou?
Oh, yes. Amazingly, when her son was still young, a woman who worked with Ann Dunham, she worked for a while in the some office at the University of Hawaii when she was still an undergraduate, but she had, her son was, a couple years old. Someone who worked in that office with her told me that Anne had told her that she wanted Barack to go to Punahou. And this woman said to me, I thought, yeah, right, when pigs fly, there's no way that this woman without a husband and this little child was going to get her child into this august school. But she did. I think that somehow Stanley or Madeleine, her parents, had some role in getting him in there as well. Yes?
In your book, which I love, sort of glossed over the father. Everybody seems to gloss over the father. Is that because it's just an enigma, there's just not that much known about him? What happened to Mary? Why did it only last a few months? And was there ever any effort to...
There is a book about him. Do you know about that book? It's by a Boston Globe reporter. It's very good. He was a pretty awful guy in a lot of ways. But I didn't go into it in great detail because I had her entire life and I had a limited amount of time, and I knew someone else was working on that part of things. And it would have required going to Africa and a whole detour that I couldn't do in the schedule that I had. He was, I think, quite brilliant, very charismatic, quite difficult, imperious, and I think, as I said briefly in the book, she realized very early on in the relationship that she was way out of her depth, and this is not where she wanted to be. I think he was abusive to later wives. He ended up an alcoholic and died in Kenya in a car accident. But there is, if you want the whole story, it was very well done. The book came out about in 2011, just a few months after mine. Yes? Lolo Soetoro, they were together. She moved to Indonesia. He was a graduate student at the University of Hawaii. He was yanked back to Indonesia after what's called a coup that occurred that led to the overthrow of Sukarno when Suharto took over in the mid-60s. I'm told that many foreign students were called back who'd gone there with government backing, and he was then had to go and finish what he owed his country in the military. So she went back there, lived with him. I think the marriage was already strained. President Obama writes about this in his memoir, and it's well known, already strained in that first period where they're living together in Indonesia, where he had gone from being a kind of very gay, lively, party animal sort of student at the University of Hawaii to being back in the bosom of his family and culture in Indonesia, and it put a strain on their marriage. And so anyway, it got fraught, but they had a child in 1970. Then they were apart when she went back to Hawaii for graduate school. And then they came back, and I think he at that point was involved with somebody else. So over time, the marriage just fell apart. He died in the mid-'80s of liver disease, and he came from a family, quite a, class terms don't really apply equally, in the way they do. To say middle class doesn't mean that much in Indonesia, but a reasonably, affluent family where most of the children went to college. And by the time I started writing this book, he was one of, I think, 10 children, and all of them were dead. There's all sorts of health issues and things that apparently happened during the, Japanese occupation of Indonesia or during the war, and so yeah, he's dead too. Anything else? Yes, John.
Janny, can you just comment on your perception of being a news reporter or journalist versus being an author, a writer, and where you're going in terms of how do you compare two, I think, very different jobs?
Well, I was a journalist for 30-some years, a newspaper reporter. I absolutely loved my job at the Times. This book came completely out of the blue, as I said, arose out of a story that I did for the Times, and I think I never would have had the courage to try to write a book had it not been an offer I couldn't refuse. I mean, a book that I knew actually how to go about doing it. And then having done it and also happening upon this other material, I just felt like it was a bigger challenge to try and do another book, a different book, or better book, whatever. And I feel somewhat inadequate to the task, being trained as a reporter, and also drawn into journalism probably by the desire not to write about yourself, to turn the attention always to everyone else. But it just feels like part of the varied diet of a writer might include pushing yourself in that direction. But I do think that the muscles that go into writing something like what I'm trying to do now, or to many books, they somewhat atrophy in journalism. That journalism is, even at a wonderful place like the Times, where you can work on projects for a long time and write at length, it's still short-term and relatively short, and there's a kind of immersion that you can do with a book that is exciting and challenging at this time in my career. Yes?
I remember when Connie was writing her book, she had all sorts of plans of other books she'd like to write. She was going to write with children. I mean, it was like, okay, I got to do this, but this is what I'm going to do. Do you find that as you're moving forward, you think, this would be, this might go for a little bit, and then go back and
When I'm feeling really frustrated with what I've chosen, I think of all sorts of great ideas. Yeah, Connie had the ability to keep multiple things in her head at the same time. Like, she, took a very discreet book leave, executed her book brilliantly and very quickly. I'm not as capable of that. No, I don't really find that I wander into other ideas. I mostly try to keep myself focused on the one that I'm trying to do. So thank you all. You're very nice to come.